In 1992, Mick Doohan severely broke his leg riding that Honda 500cc monster he used to ride back then at the Dutch TT Grand Prix at Assen. Now the injury was so severe that he couldn't actually operate the rear brake with his right foot. So what they did was they constructed and installed a thumb-operated rear brake on the handlebar of the motorcycle. And I believe he went on to utilize that in a number of races back in the day when he was at the top of his game. Now today, more than 30 years later, many, if not most pro racers and a lot of amateur riders actually use thumb brakes. What I want to talk about in this particular video is what we learned about installing thumb brakes on the BMW S1000RR. What the video is not going to discuss is the benefits of a thumb brake, how to actually operate that. We're going to talk about that in a very specific video later. So what is a thumb brake? In simple terms, it's exactly what it sounds like. It is a braking control that is mounted on the left-hand handlebar that you use the thumb to operate, which functions or activates the rear brake. There are various options that you can employ for installing thumb brakes on motorcycles. First and most rudimentary of all the options is where you remove the rear brake completely, right? You take away the master cylinder and then you get a thumb brake master cylinder which you mount on the handlebar, and then that routes directly through the system to the rear brake caliper. Now, that's not a system we would recommend. A friend of ours found this out recently. In an emergency situation, what's going to happen is you're going to do what you normally do without thinking, and that is slam the brakes on by squeezing the front brake with the right hand and looking for the back brake with your right foot. That's going to be your natural unconscious reaction, and that could contribute to you crashing. So I would always recommend that you leave the rear brake in place and then you add to the system with a thumb brake. Second option is where you get a thumb brake master cylinder which mounts on the handlebar. That then connects to the rear brake master cylinder that is currently in place by virtue of a special valve. The third option, which is the option that we actually chose, is where you get a master cylinder that goes on the handlebar for thumb brake operation, obviously, but then you replace the rear brake master cylinder that is currently in place with a slave cylinder. And that slave cylinder is fed primarily from the master cylinder up on the handlebar when it comes to the fluid, but it allows for rear brake operation with the foot. It identifies or differentiates between thumb brake operation and rear foot operation, and it's a very cool system. So that's the one that we actually chose. I experienced a number of challenges in installing this particular Beringer thumb brake system on the S1000RR. The first and most rudimentary of the challenges is working out the length of the brake line itself. They don't come with a brake line, nor could I find any information about the length of it or the angles of the attachments or anything like that. So what I ended up doing was stripping the bike down. I got some stainless steel wire cable that mimicked the bend capability of a braided brake line. I then routed that a number of different ways through the bike until I found the best situation which allowed the cable to flow without bending too much and allowed the ends to approach where they would attach at the master cylinder and slave cylinder ends at such an angle that it would actually be a workable brake line. I then gave an estimated length and an estimated angle of those heads with a second option to a local company, Knight's Brakes here in Cairns. They made up the two options, they sent it to us, and then we found the one that fitted perfectly. The second and most difficult of the challenges to overcome is actually getting air out of the brake line. So I approached this in a number of different ways. The first thing I did was, once we installed it, I called a mate who's got a battery-operated, motorised brake bleeding system. He came over and we got as much fluid through the line and as much air out of the system as we possibly could. The second thing we needed to do was bleed the ABS. Now, we left the ABS intact on this bike for street riding requirements, and the ABS is located quite high. It's up near the seat. So we had to get air out of that, and there's a service function in the BMW electronics which allows you to bleed the ABS specifically. The third thing I did was I ended up leaning the bike over, right over on the right hand side. We used the jacking system to crank it right over on an angle that allowed the thumb brake master cylinder to actually be at the highest point. And the intent of that was to try and get as much air out of the system by allowing it to flow to the top, and we bled the master cylinder itself. So I don't believe we've got all the air out even to today, so we're going to continue to work on that particular thing. Now, the final thing that we were challenged with was the clutch mechanism specifically. When we bought the Beringer thumb brake system, it came with the clutch installed. It was this complete mechanism. So it's just a beautiful piece of machinery. The thumb brake can actually detach from the clutch, but they require each other to be attached, because if I remove the clutch mechanism, there's no back half of the actual clamping area. So the two parts needed to go together. What we didn't realize is that BMW have a very specific micro switching system on the clutch, and it's not a one-way switch. There's actually two switches on there. And the reason they do that is it needs to send a signal to the ECU, to the electronics, to let it know when the clutch is pulled or pulled in. And the reason for that is if you're operating launch control, the revs are controlled by the engine when the clutch is actually pulled in, and then once you release it, it starts to change the way the electronics work or the revs work. So it needed to understand when the clutch was pulled in. It also needed that for the operation of the mode switching. So anyone who's got a BMW knows that when you switch modes, you engage that mode after you've selected it by pulling the clutch in. The second thing it needed to do was it needed to send a signal to the motor when the clutch was released. And the reason it needed that was for the operation of the quick shifter. So this micro switching system, we couldn't duplicate it using the Beringer recommended switching system. So the solution for us was to simply go and buy an additional part which allowed us to clamp the thumb brake onto the clip-on without the clutch mechanism, and then reattach the BMW clutching mechanism. So there's plenty of room on the clip-on to be able to do that. Now, I've got a couple of tips for you if you're going to install one of these thumb brake systems on a BMW S1000RR. Number one, do your research, right? Go out there, search for information, watch this video, read the notes below, contact people who've installed these and ask advice on it. Because if I had had that advice, I probably wouldn't have had so many difficulties or as many challenges as we actually had. The second thing is, if you've got a BMW, avoid replacing the clutch lever assembly. As I said in the previous points, it's got a micro switching mechanism there that is very specific to the needs of BMW. And there is no switching mechanism that I could obtain that would allow me to install that Beringer clutch system. The third tip I'm going to give you is this. If you are going to separate the thumb brake from the clutching mechanism on a BMW, then you've got to recognize that you probably need to replace the switching system. So you'll see in our motorcycle we have jet prime switches. They are slightly thinner than the factory original switching mechanism, and a way better switching mechanism anyway. So why wouldn't you go to it? When you put that switch, the jet prime switch on there, it leaves space on the clip-on to actually have three things mounted there. So if you're going to do that, get yourself a set of jet prime switches as well. So in closing, I just want to leave you with a couple of thoughts. First of all, thumb brake is dead set to go. If you've never ridden with one, you've got to try it, particularly if you're riding on track. And what I'm going to do is talk about the benefits of using a thumb brake, what it's like to ride with one, how you would go about learning the operation of a thumb brake in the next set of videos. So I'll see you there.